I always wanted to be able to print my cyanotypes onto really delicate paper, but I was struggling, and a viewer saw this and gave me a fantastic tip. Printed and decorated tissue paper is wonderful in its own right, and it's fantastic for layering onto collages and into journals when you don't want to make the pages too bulky. After my first attempt to print a cyanotype onto tissue paper was incredibly nerve-wracking, as you can see here, because the paper is just so fragile when it's wet. I'm not sure I would have tried again until I got this brilliant tip from Julie as a comment under the video. She said, "I've been obsessed with cyanotypes this summer too. For your delicate papers, have them on corrugated plastic boards, and then you can run the water over the paper and the board together and let them dry right on the board. Works like a charm." So when I next decided to do some cyanotypes, and I usually decide in a hurry because the conditions are right, the sun's out, but it's not too windy, etc., I had to look round to see what I could use that would do this supporting, and so would be waterproof, but would also fit in my rinsing tray. And I got out various prints from my stash of lightweight paper. Yes, I do keep everything. And there's a variety of different sorts of prints. So the green one is done with acrylic paint. The ones I'm doing now, I've got these 3 flowers that actually went through my inkjet printer. I stuck the tissue paper onto paper, regular copy paper, and fed it through the printer. So it's just inkjet ink, and I'm not sure whether it's going to stand up to it. And also I've got 1 or 2 that are done with monoprint, and that's using various inks. So they're kind of all different things, and it's going to be fun to see what works. And I'm just in subdued lighting in my studio, and I'm applying my cyanotype solution. I'll link a video here if you want to know how to mix it up and paint it yourself. It's very straightforward. You just have to be a little bit careful, and you have to allow ahead because the chemicals have to kind of sit for a bit before you use them. So the first print that you'll see was a jelly print done onto calligraphy paper, which is lightweight but not quite as translucent as tissue paper. And I did it with ferns, and I thought it would be really fun to sort of fill in the negative shape that this print made with more ferns. You know, it's kind of a bit meta, but I just thought it'd be interesting to see what the effect was. So after I applied the solution, waiting for it to dry, and it does dry quite quickly on these very lightweight paper, I'm just kind of playing with the ferns to get a pleasing composition. And I had some pieces of polystyrene that I was already using to expose the cyanotypes with, and I just had to cut them down to size a bit so they'd fit in my rinsing tray, and that was going to be the first support that I tried. And I'm putting a piece of glass over everything so it will stop it blowing away and keep everything close to the paper as it's exposed. And then I decided to put some sort of short round-headed pins to pin the paper actually to the polystyrene so that when I was rinsing it, it was going to all stay together and not just float off. And then it goes out into the sun for a good few minutes. I think I've speeded this up about 10 times. So I think I left it there for a good 10 minutes just because the sun was going in and out a little bit, and I wanted to make sure I got a really good exposure. Also, the thinner the paper is, the less cyanotype solution actually kind of goes into the paper. So again, I wanted to make sure that it had really good exposure. So then I took it over into the shade where I've got my water bath waiting, and carefully took off the glass and took off the ferns and dunked the whole thing, polystyrene and all, into the water. And one thing I thought was maybe it wouldn't rinse so well just because the water can't get underneath the paper. But I think you can see that actually also another good thing about leaving it to it, the longer you expose it, the more cyanotype solution has been used and there's less to rinse out, if that makes sense. So, and also this was quite a big area that was getting the blue, so there wasn't an awful lot of fluid to leach out. And it did it just as easily as if I didn't have the board, but better because it's supporting it. So yeah, and you can see it's turning blue as the rest of it rinses out, and also as it's oxidizing. So the oxygen carries on reacting with the ions in the paper. And I'm just making sure it's really well rinsed, and then I'm going to take it out of the tray and put it on the side indoors actually to dry. One thing I did find is that it took a lot longer to dry, because if you've just got the paper sitting on some newspaper or a bit of fabric, the air can really get to it because it's sitting on what is really just a sort of bit of plastic. It just took quite a long time for the water to completely evaporate. This next print is a monoprint I did with using an oil-based ink onto tissue paper using a sort of sketching kind of method. And so this is the really thin paper. You can't really get much thinner than this. I think it is on proper wet strength tissue paper, if I remember. That's one of the problems when you're doing old things. You can't always remember what materials you used, but I'm pretty sure there is wet strength. So this is a real test, and again I've used a piece of polystyrene, and it's been in the sun for several minutes, and now you can see there's a bit more of the green fluid coming out of this than last time, but it's turning a beautiful shade of blue. And I'm going to do the same thing. It's just so much easier than how I was struggling with it last time. It just seems so simple and so obvious, but so helpful to be able to do it like this, because everything just stays in place. And again, I'd put pins through it just to make sure that it wasn't going to float off the polystyrene. And already you can see that there's been a good print take place. I've just got to wait for it to dry, and then you'll see it in its full glory. So this one is a very similar jelly print to the first one, but I'm using a transfer that's got one of my own designs that I've done in Procreate and then printed onto transparency. Do let me know if you'd like me to go into more detail with this. It's quite straightforward, and it just means you can convert anything into the means to create all these gorgeous layers. And again, I'm using tissue paper, but this time it's been printed on going through my inkjet printer. And because I've got these cutting mats and they were to hand, and I wanted to get on with the prints before the sun went in, I thought, well, that will work. It's plastic and it's rigid. And I taped it on using a bit of masking tape. And actually, I think that worked really well. And the print I'm using here is a transfer of a sort of garden plan from Tivoli Gardens in Italy, if you know that. And yeah, I'm intrigued to see how this will turn out. And for this last print, I chose a painting that I'd done in some sketchbook work, and again converted it into a negative print on a transparency using my printer. And I looked around for what I already had, and I didn't really have any more boards, and I was worried about the sun going in, so I just chose this sort of, I mean, it's quite a thick bit of plastic. In retrospect, I've proved that this isn't a good way of doing it. I just thought because I'm attached it to the plastic using masking tape, maybe that will be enough to prevent it from wrinkling up. And the good thing about it is that it's sort of, I could fit it into the tray quite easily. But you'll see when I kind of reveal at the end whether you think this was a good method. So it's now been a good few hours. I just left them on the side in my utility room to dry out completely. And now I'm sort of taking everything off, and this is always an exciting bit. And I don't think this is the best light to see it, but actually this has worked pretty well. I think because the original paint was a sort of dull brown, it's not created the most exciting colour combination. But I do really like how the shapes have been filled in with more ferns, and also you can see that it has sort of worked a bit over the paint as well. When I've done it with cartridge paper and thicker paint, you can't really see any of the cyanotype over it, but because, as I say, when you apply paint to thinner paper as less of the paint, I think that's why it hasn't completely resisted it. And I think this one's come out really nicely. I love the way this is one of my own handwriting that I made a transfer of, and that's worked really well. I love the combination, because what I think I really like is that you can see both the original print and the new print both together, and that's what's quite exciting, I think, about this method. And it's got so much potential if I sort of do something in a more intentional way. So that brings me on to this one. So this was the one that I did over, it was an allium flower that I'd printed out through the inkjet printer. And I think two things happened here. I think some of the ink from that original print just soaked away in the water because it's not particularly permanent. And it's just not a very interesting contrast. So whereas in the last one you've got the writing and you've got the shapes and they can relate together, this just looks like a sort of nice cyanoprint over a slightly smeary piece of paper. So although the cutting mat worked really well as a support, and I'll do that again because it's a perfect size for sort of A4, I just think the print itself wasn't one of my favourites. And you do have to be very careful when you're sort of peeling off the masking tape, because the paper is so fragile, even though when it's dry it's a little bit more robust. But yeah, so it's just not a very good combination, but the support worked well, and that's the main thing. And you can see when I hold it up to the light that although you can see the cyanoprint really well, and it's lovely how you can see it on both sides, you can't really see much of the original flower. And then this one is the other jelly print that was on the calligraphy paper, also called rice paper. So it's nice and thin. It's good for printing jelly prints with, because you can really sort of mould around the leaves and get lots of detail. And it does seem to be quite robust in water. And I really like how the details picked out in that. It's sort of, you wouldn't think that was just from a cyanotype. You think that it's sort of gone through some other printing process. And then this is the last one that was on the bit of just flexible bit of plastic, and you can see it's kind of a disaster, although I do manage to save it. It just wrinkled and crinkled so much that it tore in several places, which is a shame because the actual print I was really pleased with. I just love how you can sort of convert a painting in through, you know, a couple of processes, and it can be a print that you can then layer over other pieces of work. So I'm definitely going to do that again. And I did find a way to sort of make this better. What I did was that I tore some of the sort of extra bits of tissue paper, which is thinner than this calligraphy paper, from the outsides of some of the other prints, and I just sort of patched up from the back. And I'm using a bit of matte gel medium. This is almost dried out, this one, which was quite good because I didn't want to introduce too much extra liquid. And then I just layered the little bits of paper over the cracks and tried to sort of join it up as much as I could. And after that I cut off some of the edges. And a tip if you ever want to trim tissue paper is you have to go very carefully. Instead of trying to do it in sort of one fell swoop, even though it's such thin paper, if you go really gently, then it stops the paper from buckling up. So take me like 4 or 5 goes with the sort of like the smallest amount of pressure. I was just testing it then to see it had gone through, and it hadn't. So I think this one last pass through and that's done. And that way you don't get those sort of rucked up edges. And I think you'll agree that it's been quite a good, I've sort of managed to save this one, and I actually quite like it in the end. So it just goes to show that we're all learning from each other in this community. And if you've got a fantastic tip and you want to share it with everyone, please let me know in the comments. And if you want to know what to do with your prints, keep posted, because I've got a special video coming up, but in the meantime you might find this one helpful.